Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here to talk about how to incorporate scripture into your writing in APA style. We're going to be talking about some places of common confusion. And if you're ever writing about the Bible in a dissertation, a course paper, or a discussion post, we're going to clarify how you can do that in APA style. Now, if you are joining us from our Graduate School of Theology, many of your assignments will use Society of Biblical Literature, which is a different thing, but you can find information about that on the Online Writing Center website. With no further ado, let's go ahead and dive into looking at how to cite and reference the Bible in APA 7 and look at specifically how you would do that through the lens of a specific assignment, drawn in this case from BCMO 335. So, how to cite and reference the Bible in APA 7? Well, if you're not dealing specifically with APA style, the general convention is to give us the key information to find the text you're referring to, which is normally going to be book, if you're referring to a book as a whole. If you're referring to the contents of a chapter, book and chapter, or book, chapter, and verse. And to be very specific, you can always give all three sets of information. So for example, if you say, according to John 3:16, we know we're referring to the book, New Testament book referred to as the Gospel of John, the third chapter, and the 16th verse. And this is something where there are international conventions and agreements about what is the division of that book into chapters and verses. Now, if you are referring to something that has more than one book, like first book of Corinthians, second book of Corinthians, etc., you just put that number before the book name. And so this follows the common parlance that we use. Oh, 2 Corinthians, third letter to John, 3 John, or whatever it should be. 3 John is not a great example, but first and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, so forth. All right, so if we were to look in the APA, a 7th edition manual for the rules, we get something like this. Now, let's break down what this is, because King James Bible, that first example, that's saying not that the original text was published in 2017, but that this online version, the King James Bible Online, dates from 2017, and that the original translation that we call the King James Bible was created in 1769, which is why you'd get in the sample parenthetical citation, King James Bible 1769/2017. We're going to talk about a variation on this later because you can have a translation that is revised. And so, for example, if we're referring to the New King James Bible, that has a new name, just like there was a international version, and that was the title of the translation, the international version. And then there's now a new international version. Now, the new international version was actually revised, so you might have a publication date that corresponds to that specific revised translation, as you'll see shortly. So if you're seeing two sets of numbers, it's because the publication is not aligning with the translation that is being cited, usually with something like the King James Bible here, where the original translation was created hundreds of years later. So if we are looking at how to cite passages of scripture, we have some additional notes that again may cause some confusion because of what exactly it's referring to. Because here we're talking about referencing that specific translation, but when we are citing a specific source and doing a part like chapters or verses, when we are dealing with what are called canonically numbered, things where there's international agreement, perhaps by a professional society, sometimes by treaty, sometimes by something else, long tradition, when we have what are called canonically numbered editions. So the King James Bible is canonically numbered. The original publication actually had the different verses specifically numbered. And so it's very easy to agree on that because you could just go to that original work and see that. Same thing with the works of Aristotle. By long tradition of scholarship, the works have been canonically divided into certain parts. And there's agreement about the standard text for that. Same thing with the works of Shakespeare, for example, at least as far as a certain publication of that. So if you're referring to those and not to a specific translation, you might refer to, oh, yes, to King James Bible, 1 Corinthians 13:1. And sometimes there are some shorthand abbreviations, as you see here. It is not incorrect to spell out the full name Corinthians. It's just in this case, for canonically a numbered work, sometimes there are canonical abbreviations as well. So if in doubt, just give the whole name. Now, when you're writing about the Bible, you may frequently be talking about your own interpretation and using I statements. And that is specifically allowed in APA style and encouraged for when you're describing your personal beliefs and details related to your experience, because that clarifies who you are referring to. I believe that X. In my life, I've repeatedly seen whatever it is. Now you can mix that with a discussion of scripture, but we're starting off, if you're clarifying, this is my belief or this is my interpretation, using I, my, mine is very helpful. Now, if we're talking about how to refer to the Bible, we have here a sample reference for the New International Version, accessed through BibleGateway.com. Now, note that this says New International Version, Revised Edition, because the Revised Edition was an update of the translation that was published in 2011 and immediately added to BibleGateway.com. So this is why we don't see, for this specific translation and edition, we don't see two different publication years like we did with the King James Bible. And this is the case with most more recent translations or revisions of translations. So now we're talking a summary. So even if you're reading the New International Version, if you're just referring to the content of that particular book, we're not referring to a specific translation. So it is entirely correct to write in Galatians 3:1-6, Paul castigates the Galatian Christian community for their straying from core teachings. Again, this is a summary of a canonically numbered source. And so we're not going to be specifically citing the translation because this is true of all the translations and the original Greek. Now, what if we're doing summary and a quotation? Well, again, same thing that we're reading, the New International Version, Revised Edition. But look at this. In Galatians 3:1-6, Paul castigates the Galatian Christian community for their straying from core teachings, stating, after beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh? So here we're giving the exact text. And this, because we're giving the exact text as translated into English for the specific translation's revision, we're going to have all that information there so we can identify exactly where that's coming from, which is why it's New International Version. In square brackets, we have Revised Edition, or the abbreviation for that, Ed, 2011, that's when that revised edition came out, and Galatians 3:3. That's the specific book, chapter, and verse that we are quoting from. Now, we've got two things mashed up in that sentence. The first part is the summary. That's the Galatians 3:1-6, and then the discussion after it. And we've got the quotation at the end, which requires that larger set of information because that's how APA requires that you identify specific direct quotations. All right. So what if you're analyzing and discussing this? Well, again, we're just starting with that same source, that same revised translation of the Bible. And you're reading that and you say, oh, in Galatians 3, Paul makes 8 references to the biblical patriarch Abraham using covenant language. Same thing, we're discussing a canonically named source and you're analyzing the content. In this case, counting up the references and describing the language. And so that's going to be the most granular level that you're referring to, which happens to be book, Galatians, and chapter 3. Contrast that with if you're analyzing and quoting. In Galatians 3, Paul makes 8 references to the biblical patriarch Abraham using phrases such as, and then we have a direct quotation, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. So we quoted that directly, so we need to identify specifically what's going on. Now, back up here. So here we have two sets of information: New International Version, Revised Edition, publication year, then chapter and verse. So here we have instead Galatians 3:29, New International Version, Revised Edition 2011. So how are we going to navigate the apparent conflict between these? Think about that for a moment. Well, the answer is that the previous version was a mistake. So what usually happens is someone starts and they write down the chapter, the book chapter verse information, and then they go hunt for the information for that citation. And we have a couple things that we want to do here. And one of those is to make sure we've done all of our due diligence here. And the norm is, as you see here, to have the page number or the book chapter verse information at the end of the parenthetical citation. And so we also need to look at this and say, hold on, we forgot when updating this to put the Galatians 3:29 at the end of the source. And we also need to take New International Version and italicize that. So what's that going to look like when we put all that stuff together? We're going to have the title of the translation, that's New International Version. And yes, you would say, but wait, King James Bible had Bible in the name. Yes, but the name of that translation is specifically the King James Bible. This one is just New International Version, and from context, we know it's about the Bible, but the official title is actually New International Version. That's it. So we have, in this case, because New International Version has multiple editions, we need to identify the one we're referring to, which is the Revised Edition. And 2011, that's when it was published, and Galatians 3:29. All right. So keep those in mind, because that putting the book chapter verse in the wrong place and forgetting to italicize the translation name that is also the name of the published book itself, which has no known author. We don't know the people who first wrote that down by name, so that's why we're having the book title there instead of author name. Having all those things in that order is a leading cause of losing points. And you might ask, hold on, wait, aren't we missing something there? And you say, hold on, I see you have a parentheses here, you've got a parentheses here, you've got one closing here. Excellent spotting. So here, that revised edition, we need to go ahead and wrap that in square brackets. All right, let's take care of that. And so here we have the corrected final version of that citation for the quote. Now, if we're to go talk through this assignment here, let's just look through what that's referring to. So we have this assignment from the Spiritual Formation 1 course, and you see that we start with the preamble, discussion about certain topics to discuss, and a specific outline of things that should be in here. And when it comes to doing that handout, the summary there should have 2 to 4 biblical examples with scriptural references. So we need to have our book, chapter, verse information. And if you are quoting it or referring to specific word choices, you should be having that translation cited and in your references list. So again, at least 2. It's going to look something like those references that we saw earlier. I've already given you examples for the New International Version's Revised Edition, and you saw in the example from the APA 7 manual for citing the King James Bible version. And while APA formatting is not required, if you're referring to the Bible, you should definitely have that book, chapter, verse information, and if you're referring to specific translation, that. My recommendation is, because you're going to be required to do this in APA style later, to do that now so you're building that skill, building that habit. And if we look at the rubric, again, it reiterates that, hey, you must have a list of at least 2 to 4 biblical examples and your explanations of why these things are essential for spiritual formation, which could include additional references to those required examples. And just make sure, if you're discussing specifics following analysis and summary or discussion, that your examples are giving the appropriate information for the type of thing that you're doing. Are you referring to the text generally? Book, chapter, verse. Or if just to the book as a whole, book, chapter. If you're referring to specific wording, though, and quoting it, you're going to need that translation. Or if you're going to refer to a specific word that's not something unambiguous like a name, then you'll want to go ahead and, again, list the specific quote inside the specific translation. That's all we have time for today. If you have any questions, feel free to visit us online or send an email to onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. Have a great day.